Good morning and welcome back to the lecture series. We are discussing the short story and novel, a comparative understanding of these two genres. We will begin with Rust Hills and his understanding of the key features of a short story. According to Rust Hills, the short story tells us about something that happened to someone, which makes it different from the sketch. So, we have to understand that we also have a very similar form to short story, which is the sketch. However, short story and the sketch, unlike what many readers fathom, are not quite the same. So, the sketch comprises the description of a character. The described character remains constant throughout the sketch. So, the description is meant to illustrate rather than develop a character in a sketch. So, a sketch, in other words, is an example of a character's behavior and not an account of incidents that move or alter the character's position. In a short story, the plot is moving, it's not static. It's a dynamic plot and the characters are moved from their original position, from the way they are, the way they think from the beginning to the end. A journey, albeit a short one, has taken place. So, the character on whom the story leaves consequences is the moved character. At the end of the narration, his or her position will shift emotionally, socially, or in any other way. So, more than most of other forms, a short story maintains a harmonious relationship of all its aspects. And this, however, is not a characteristic of a good novel. A good novel is expected to function based on minimal description and leave a lot of open ends to be filled up, to be imagined and recreated through the reader's creativity, creative reading, right? And then, while the development of character in short story is similar to the novel, we see that the novel has time and space for a number of effects, artistic effects, let's say through subplots, and so the novel can experiment with stylistic devices and narrative style. This entire scope of becoming, of developing, is not available in the case of the short story, right? So, the short story is driven by an inherent paradoxical situation. To restrict itself to limited dimensions of time that the genre entails, and yet to convey an atemporal theme through the plot, a theme that transcends the bounds of time and temporality. I would quickly, before proceeding, go through the basic premises that Rust Hills proposes as key features of the short story. One is that unlike the sketch, the short story also looks at the development of a character. The characters are moving through the plot. It's not only the description, a static description that the sketch is all about, and then the harmonious relationship of all aspects where the whole emerges even before the parts. Then Hill also talks about the greater scope of playing with the stylistic devices that the novel has, which the short story lacks. The short story writer does not elaborate or rather cannot elaborate the secondary characters and does not mess too much with the subplots, because messing too much would mean he or she cannot restore these subplots or the secondary characters within the limited time and space. Due to this same reason, the short story does not have too much scope to play around with perspectives. Usually, there is a single point of view to retain focus on the plot. Short stories usually focus on one problem only. That's the maximum one can resolve within the bounds of the short story. Getting into the heart of one problem and trying to deal with that. In terms of language, multiple use of sounds and words make the short story comparable with lyric poetry. So, like in T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound's poetry, there are intricate systems of poetic metaphor and imageries, from drawn from fable, myth, and fairy tales, which inform the short story. And these poetic metaphors and influences from folk tales, from ballads, myths, to the extent that some of the short stories can actually be read as an extended poem. A language of a short story, apart from fulfilling the need of narration, also promptly connects with the theme, mood, and action. So, all of these aspects need to be bound together. The theme of the short story, its mood, its actions, and language becomes vital in setting up the author's tone and style, which in turn contributes to the characterization and the point of view of the short story. In a typical successful short story, all the different aspects, the tonality, the actions, the theme, the characters, all of them should work in tandem, and each feature, each aspect should enhance and interrelate with the other feature. Short story should reflect an inseparable and synchronized composed economy thereby. So, Claire Hansen notes that short story as a form mediates between the lyric and the novel. It has imparts qualities, features of the lyric and then that of the novel too. And yet, through experimentation, one also sees that short story is coming up with new genres, new possibilities, new avatars, if we may. That is when short stories are created through interacting with essay, with letter, cinema, photography, painting, and visual arts. Critics note that short story has split allegiance to the narrative and the lyric. For short story to progress, there has to be a disruption from regular, familiar, everyday encounters, and so there has to be a breakaway from the routine, from the premeditated, kind of pre-programmed actions, fixed actions. The extraordinary, the oddity, the paranormal, all these traits constitute the plot, the torque for the short story, right? The shock, the jolt make up the propelling force for the short story. While the fixed action enhances characterization, an incident that leads to a breakaway from fixed action introduces the potential plot for the short story. The disruption from the normal, the routine, the everyday elicits actions from the characters, something that is one-off, that is spontaneous and non-repetitive, non-regular, an action that is unfamiliar thereby, which drives the plot forward. So, fixed actions are a preliminary part. It sets the stage for the short story, the background of the short story, even before the short story has begun. If it is a story. Once it enters within the premises of the story, it has to cut off from the mundane. If we can understand how a narrative happens through the lens of different structuralist thinkers. So, for example, Algirdas Julian Reimers notes that the perception of oppositions, of any form of conflict, followed by resolution, or sometimes not followed by resolution, underlies the structure of any signification, any meaning that a narrative tries to posit, tries to hold. Meaning in a narrative takes shape through the reader's perception of these conflicts, these differences. And so the structure, Reimers is talking about something that he terms as the enunciation spectacle, the structure of the enunciation spectacle, which is the fundamental structure of language or grammar, and this remains the same for all the stories. For any form of narration, the manifestation, the performance of this enunciation spectacle changes depending on the actants or the different themes embodying and performing it. This is very similar to Lang's relation with Parole, where all stories are, springing from the same grammar, just like Paroles are individual dialects, individual performance of the self-same Lang. Here we see that enunciation spectacle is like the common repository, and the different actants and themes, the stock characters, it could be a motive that keeps coming back, a motive that manifests through different characters, and it is the individual performance of the enunciation spectacle, which still remains the same for all types of narrations across time and space. This is what Reimers has to say. Similarly, Tizedvet and Todorov points out that any narrative comprises a series of propositions or events. That holds true regardless of whether we are talking about the epic, the novel, the short story. This holds true both of what what both Reimers and Todorov say hold true for all the genres, right? So Todorov talks about propositions or events that could be related to each other in terms of time, so temporally, spatially, or logically. And then how is one proposition made? Each proposition is a combination of a noun, meaning a character, with either an adjective or a verb. So the character has a certain attribute, or the character does something, an action of the character. This is what constitutes an event, and a series of such events centering time, space, or causality makes up any narration, right? This is what Tizedvet and Todorov has to say. According to John Gerlach, there can be a number of narrative clausural categories for short stories. One of the ways of closing a short story could be through solution of the central problem, which is the most common way of concluding. And this trait of tying the loose end is typical and unique to short story that does not always happen in novels. In novels, like I have already said, there can be certain open ends, right? Certain problems that are not resolved till the end. So, going back to Gerlach's different clausural categories, the first one, solution of the central problem. Either a goal is achieved, or if unachievable, a certain completion, coherence, or stability is attained towards the end. Next, Gerlach talks about the second possibility of closure, which is natural termination of the story, meaning that a completion of an action takes place with a predictable end. Next is completion of antithesis. So, the story ends with an opposition often characterized by irony, which may indicate polarized extremities on a given subject, or circularity by returning to an aspect mentioned at the beginning through verbal or situational echo. Right? Uh, so, the entire story tries to posit a thesis, tries to shape a thesis, and the end uh, is an opposition. It's a subversion of that entire thesis. So, the story the story is formed through polarized extremities on a given subject, where the subject was being dealt with from a certain angle till a different angle was adopted in the end. Or there could be a circularity where the narrator or the author returns to the self same aspect that was mentioned at the very beginning, or through verbal or situational echo. Then we have manifestation of a moral. This is another possibility of closing the short story, through manifestation of a moral. It draws on the genre of parable, where an example is set at the end, a lesson is taught, it has didactic purpose. A theme emerges towards the end, whose effect is similar to the moral in the exemplum tradition. And Gerlach is talking about one more possibility for ending the short story, which is through encapsulation. Uh, Encapsulation meaning that the story has a concluding passage that distances the reader, either by altering the point of view or through summarizing a passage of time. So, some time has elapsed since the core problem of the plot occurred. And this, through this summarizing, or through telling us in the end that some time has elapsed, there is a kind of relief which enables the reader to distance herself from the core plot. These closural strategies can also be applied. These closural signals or strategies can also be applied. They can also occur in poems, in novels, and in drama. So, as a shorter fiction, closure of a short story is structurally very important to it. In approaching a character from the position of a short story writer, one can treat the character either as an individual or as a subject. So, there can be two ways of looking at the characters of a given short story. One could look at them as an individual in their individual capacity through their ordinary acts, or as a symbol, what they stand for. There is a larger meaning associated with them, and where their ordinary acts become less important. An overriding meaning is something that needs to that informs the short story. So, the realistic approach, the individual approach, looks at a short story in the context of its similarity with the real world. This is, like I said, the realistic approach. And then the other approach, which is also something I have mentioned just now, it is to treat the structure of the story plot as a scheme or a code. Story as a code that needs to be decoded, right? That needs to be deciphered. And here the characters are not in their individual capacities, but as archetypes, and they are there by virtue of the position that they hold in the larger schema. This reading is called the allegorical or metaphorical approach. Peter Brooks, however, says that the metaphor that lies in eventual totalization, and which is understood only in retrospect, draws meaning from as well as lends meaning to the realist sequence of events. So, in other words, the metaphoric and the realistic aspects reflect on one another. We begin our readings generally through the realistic approach, where characters are individuals. Still, we have journeyed to a certain point in the story and we realize that the characters represent and stand for some larger concepts, and that goes also, the realistic reading goes on to become a metaphorical reading when once we start deciphering this code, this scheme through our journey with the narrator, right? And this second style of reading, this second mode of reading or analysis generally comes in hindsight, in retrospect. Owing to its shortness of form, short story lacks a social framework, and it draws greatly on its provenance in myth, and focuses on a basic sense of mystery, paranormal, bizarre, odd, and extraordinary, right? According to Robert Langbaum, the author's endless introspection of who am I? This is also an introspection, an existential question that prods the novelist. And this question, the short story writer's question of who am I, is answered through the author donning a mask and stepping into the story, within the frame of the story, where at the level of experience, events eventually fall into a pattern, and the author's will in the due course is unraveled and objectified. So, in other words, through the making of the story, the author is answering to this existential question of who I am. Maybe garbed as one of the characters, the author's will is eventually revealed. So, the question of epiphany, the revelation, the realization of the characters within the bounds, within the frame of the story, is not only a fictional realization, it could also be the author's realization in her real life. Through the necessity of the story, the author discovers his or her identity and what he or she aspires for, something that has hitherto remained besides the conscious state of mind. The practice of writing, it's therapeutic, and it's a way of disinterring the unconscious desire and aspirations of the writer. So, in the schematic, conventionalized structure of short story, the character becomes an automaton-like figure who serves his or her place in the larger schema. This is the conventional structure of short story. The allegorical character, having a code-bound nature, is driven by a given central obsession. The only way to approach an allegorical character is through referencing to its position in and as a pre-existing code. So, unless we read the character, some of the stories entail this reading, where individual reading does not make too much of meaning. It does not make a lot of sense unless we read the characters as symbols, as standing for something else, a larger concept, for example. So, characters as code, the story as a scheme, and such characters, such plots defy realistic analysis. When realistically analyzed, the obsession of the character is explored without, right? So, when we are doing the realistic analysis, we are studying the characters from or on the outside, whereas allegorical characters analysis entail, looking at their inner journey, their inner universe. When these allegorical narratives are written, the source of obsession is positioned inside of the character's psyche. So, the possibility of this obsession lies within and cannot be identified through the external behavior. Example is Edgar Allan Poe's writing. So, Poe's focus is on the perverse, neurotic side of the human nature. His characters are mostly obsessive, compulsive, they have their own psychosis, their own quirks, and this behavior that they posit, that they betray, is beyond any common sense, any reason, rationality, and can even flout their own best interests, the best interest of their own survival, right? Such mysterious, obsessive characters that can be best read through the allegorical lens of reading are found in Nathaniel Hawthorne's Wakefield, Young Goodman Brown, and then Melville's Bartleby, of course, Cortázar's Axolotl, and so forth. Such an allegorical character, as I mentioned, flows out of social, historical, and cultural contexts. They cannot be contained within the parameters of real coordinates, cannot hold them amply, sufficiently. They constantly flow out of the social, historical, and cultural contexts, rather than a character that is obsessed. In these cases, they are themselves an epitome of obsession. They are not a character obsessed, but an epitome of obsession. In a short story, the different components are tied to each other through an inseparable web, in which one component has no reality when decoupled from the entirety, the entire organization. The reader can grasp comprehensively only when understanding this organized whole, this entirety. So, unity of effect, techniques of plot compression, lyricism are some of the defining features of short stories. So, according to Thomas Gullison, the unity of effect that Poe emphasizes comes from two things. According to Gullison, these two things are distillation and telescoping. So, what are these things that render unity to the short story? Distillation refers to the reader's skill of reading the metaphorical and archetypal meanings, but distillation also means steering clear of unnecessary details. Steering clear of unnecessary details, too many subplots that cannot be justified within the frame of a short story. So, a distilled short story shows the design, shows the pattern in a clearer, in a more distinct fashion. And then telescoping. Telescoping referring to focusing on where focus needs to be, the necessary details. So, these two features actually speak to each other. Only when we are distilling, we are getting rid of the extraneous, the unnecessary information that can remain undiscussed, that can be avoided. One arrives at telescoping, at focusing at the right spot of the story. The story has slots where various elements may be inserted. These slots and elements maintain a perceivable coherence in their interrelationships. So, a successful story, to conclude this entire discussion, we can summarize that a Successful story is complete, such that any addition or omission would destroy its aesthetic wholeness, its inner organization, and thereby its narrative harmony. Due to fewer narrative elements and structural plots, in the modern short story, the impressionist components are more visible. So, this is also something that harkens back Kundera's notion of the apodictic message. The message, are glimpse at the soul of the heart of the short story at once. So that is the impression that is formed at once, not by and by, not through and through, eventually, but it is there and there throughout, right? So the apodictic message, where and this happens through brevity, a practice of restraining oneself as an author, in the position of author, from giving too much description, from bringing in too many characters and subplots. So that tends to blur our vision, take us away from the apodictic message, the pith, the core of the narrative. So, in order for that to be there at once, the narrative has to be paired off. There has to be a minimal treatment. Impressionist movement, as we know, is a tradition whose forerunner was Flaubert himself, and defined fiction in the late 19th century and early 20th century. We are talking about the way we see an impression as a complete form in itself and there at once. This is also something that is understood as desirable in the modern short story. Ernst Cassirer describes the short story's singleness of effect as, I quote Cassirer, the isolated occurrence of an impression, its separation from the totality of ordinary commonplace experience, producing not only a tremendous intensification but also the highest degree of condensation. Here also we are getting two words, one is intensification and the other is condensation. They speak to each other, and so how strongly we can drive home the central message. That is possible only when we get rid of the extraneous, something that can be gotten rid of. So the short story does not take up any extra burden that it cannot justify, that it cannot do justice with. With this, I'm going to conclude today's lecture, and let's meet again with another round of discussions in our following lectures. Thank you.